Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about our post-truth present and our transhuman future, with the aim of sketching out the outlines of what awaits us in the years and the decades ahead of us. This podcast is brought to you by Rokos. Companies with limited IT budgets and personnel can now get the same cybersecurity protection as big enterprises. Rokos' Secure Access Service Edge, SASE solution, with zero trust, provides enterprise-grade comprehensive cybersecurity so that you can focus on your business. For more, please visit www.rokos.com. That's ROQOS.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.
Professor C. Fuller, welcome back. So to prepare for this conversation, I read your latest book, Nietzschean Meditations and Timely Thoughts at the Dawn of the Transhuman Era, published in 2020 by, and I'm going to say the name incorrectly, Schwab Verlag?
Verlag.
Verlag, okay. And I must say that I enjoyed reading the book probably more than any of your other books that I've read, mainly because I found it more accessible than your previous work, although maybe I realized that that maybe just be a byproduct of my having read you quite a bit lately, getting used to your style. But I digress. So let me start by giving you, using my own words, what I understand transhumanism to be, and get your reaction to the definition. And after that, I have 4 questions that I would like to ask you, and we will tackle the questions one at a time. Mm-hmm. So here's my definition. Quote, this is quoting myself. Transhumanism is a movement whose proponents actively and unabashedly promote the enhancement of the welfare of human beings and other beings through the use of sophisticated technologies. End of quote. Okay. So I think you would agree that as such, there is little that is controversial about this definition, because it's basically what humanity has been doing all along, right? Which is using technology to improve our lives and increase our comfort.
That's right.
Now, but if nothing else, I think transhumanism is controversial because I think it pushes the envelope on some core, almost taboo questions. So I want to touch on 3 of those points of what I believe are points of controversy. The first one on the question of human versus non-human. The second one on being godlike. And the third one on risk. And then I want to touch on the matter of feasibility, not really at the technological or even the societal level, but on the political level. And I'll explain what that means in terms of what I think the problem there is. So, number 1, human versus non-human. So I recently published a piece on voicebot.ai. It's a tech web magazine, but mainstream for people who are interested in AI and voice. And it was on AI politeness. Okay. So in it, I assert that we humans do not need to or should not be polite to our robots, while our robots must be polite to us. And so the position takes as a given that there is a clear line of demarcation between what is human and what is not human. I think your stand is a bit more nuanced and sophisticated than that. So how would you respond to somebody like myself who just talks about the world where you have humans and non-humans, and you should behave, in ways that are clearly human versus non-human, takes this demarcation as something very non-controversial. How would you react to that?
Well, first of all, I would say that it's actually hard to, because I did read this piece of yours, and also the video that you have that's sort of associated with this, mm-hmm. And you seem to think that there, as it were, are clearly different protocols one could be using for having a bot be human or non-human. Mm-hmm. Right. And I take your message to be we should not try to humanize the bots. And one of the best ways not to do that is by not putting in these protocols that make it look like we're talking to somebody.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. I just think it's very hard actually to draw that line in practice, and I think for a few reasons, and some of it actually goes to the way we treat human beings. As a matter of fact, when we communicate with each other, we actually do it under many different circumstances with people of varying degrees of fluency in a given language. And of course, sometimes we're talking in a medium where the channel is broken or noise filled in some way. And so, as a matter of fact, we are always in the business of filling in meaning, right, with a stimulus that is relatively impoverished. I think that's just normal, actually. And so, while on paper, one can see kind of what you're getting at, the difference between a kind of human-sounding protocol and a non-human protocol. But I think in practice, if you look at the way in which we, in fact, invest meaning in communication processes, we're actually always working with relatively impoverished stimuli. I mean, there's an interesting historical example from the early days of computer interfaces, and maybe you're familiar with this. In the mid-late 1960s, one of the guys who was developing human-computer interfaces was Joseph Weizenbaum. And he eventually wrote about what I'm going to talk about now in a famous book that was published in the 70s called Human Reason and Computer Power, Human Judgment and Computer Power, I think it's called. He discovered something that actually disturbed him a lot, and that was he developed what we would now regard as a relatively primitive sort of question and answer system having to do with the various kinds of psychiatric things. And in a way it was, so we're talking about pretty elementary computers in those days. And the point was that people could, as it were, type in symptoms and stuff and then get some kind of readout about what might be going on. And the thing that he found was that, in fact, without his trying too hard, right? So these are just protocols where, you input data and then you get a question back at you, and then you input more data and you get a question back at you. And then, some conclusions get drawn down the line. The people actually thought they were communicating with someone on the other end of the computer.
Yeah. I think that's the ELIZA project, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. The ELIZA project. That's right. Exactly right. That's what he developed. And he was really surprised by that. And he was disturbed. Right, so he's on your side of the argument. He was disturbed because he thought that shouldn't happen, and so part of what he does when he writes this book, almost 10 years later, after thinking about the significance of this, is he's one of the guys on the practical side, right, in the development of interface side, who's actually raising the alarm about dehumanization, right? That and that the more and more that computers are in fact inserted into various kinds of, previously just human to human contact, right? That people will completely blur the distinction altogether, and we'll end up in this highly dehumanized state. And he was just surprised by the extent to which how advanced it already had been in the 1960s, right? Which is long before all the sophisticated stuff gets developed. And so now the point is, he's kind of on your side of the argument, and he was very worried and very disturbed. And there's this whole line of thinking within the philosophy of artificial intelligence, and you may know about Hubert Dreyfus, perhaps the most famous guy along these lines, right? Who is very concerned about all this and philosophized a lot about it, and sort of, made lots of kind of deep notions about, that you have to be part of a human life world in order to really, in order for these kinds of interactions to actually be invested with genuine meaning as opposed to pseudo meaning. And the problem is that, all this computer interaction ends up confusing you, basically, ontologically confusing you. People start then investing emotions and things like this in machines when they shouldn't be doing it. Right? I mean, this is, and there's a whole school of thinking that continues to this day that basically backs this. And so one of the things that these artificial intelligence designers, especially the people on the practical side, the people who are going to be, developing things like what you're doing.
I mean, me and my people.
You
right?
and your bot, and your voice bots,
That's right.
right. You guys like you. There's a whole bunch of these people now who actually want they want to put a limit on just how human-like the protocols can be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we're talking about roboticists, artificial intelligence people who basically say that at least at the level of interface. Right, regardless of how computationally powerful the machine might be, but at least at the level of interface where it's dealing with the human, that there should be the kinds of restrictions that you're talking about, in order to make sure that people. So there are people very much on your side of the issue. I think it's a hopeless cause myself, but people are very concerned. So let me grant you that.
Yeah, no, but the thing is, I'm not concerned. Here's the thing, right? I'm using this as a device to get into the question of, is there a way, or is it useful for us to demarcate human versus non-human? Because my concern really is not about confusing people, right? If you read the article, you read the article, it's all about efficiency, right? When I talk to my Alexa, I'm not going to say, "Could you please tell me the time?" Right? It's just, it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense because it doesn't have emotions and it doesn't have power relations with me. And it's just efficient for me to just interrupt it, repeat myself 10 times, things I would not do.
Let me ask you a question about that. Okay, yeah. I get it. But let me ask you a question. Because insofar as people like you, of course, would like us all to be using these bots and to use all this gadgetry, right? Don't you think that if we're constantly talking to these machines and in the way that you suggest, that there not be a kind of spillover effect in the way we deal with human beings? Because in fact, these machines are functioning in the way in which humans used to function.
Yeah, I don't think so. Just like what you said before, which is we talk to each other in many different ways, right? The way I talk to my dog, I talk to my dog, right? And the dog responds, right? And I have a language for the dog, and I talk to human beings, and I talk to the bank teller, and I use different kinds of not that.
Hope not too much.
Right. But what I'm saying is that there are modalities, there is a registers of conversation, right? And so there's a register of conversation that you should have with the robot. And why should it spill over? I know I'm talking to a robot. I want to make sure that if I have a child near me, that they see that I talk to the robot in a very different way than I talk to a human being. And I don't think it's going to transfer the other way. I'm not going to start talking to other human beings the way I talk to a robot, just because there are power relations to be concerned about, right? I'm going to be polite. I'm going to, you know what I'm saying? But so I think that human beings are far more robust than that. They know.
I actually think these things blend into each other a lot more. Just like the way in which colloquial speech ends up making into formal speech, and there's a lot of kind of movement back and forth, right? I mean, so I don't think. I mean, I think it's a temporary kind of stopgap. But I think insofar as you act, because the bottom line for me is you actually want people to interact more and more with these machines. It's not like you want to restrict interaction. You just want to put a certain kind of normative guideline on how we interact with it. But you want the interaction, in fact, even to increase.
And the normative thing has nothing to do with any concern that I may have about them starting to behave in a way that confuses them about this being a human or not. It's purely about efficiency. Let's forget about this concept of, it's a human being almost. No, it is not. It is a machine. And talk to it as a machine, treat it as a machine. Now, I think I see your point about the spillover, and I think that's just a cultural thing, right? All kinds of things happen in culture.
Yeah, but look, I mean, one of the consequences, for example, of the fact that we communicate as human beings through computer interfaces all the time, right? And for various kind of very often subtle ways, we have to configure our language, right, to fit this kind of computational model that ends up having spillover effects in terms of how people talk to each other in ordinary life, and without the computer being around.
It's nothing to be concerned about.
Well, I mean, it's nothing to be concerned about, but I think it's a great example of the way in which just dealing with the computers actually does shape the way in which we deal with human beings, even when we know we're dealing with human beings.
True. I see. Yeah.
You know, I mean, look at I'll give you an example. I mean, look, these guys at Silicon Valley, okay? All these wonderful people in Silicon Valley who spend all their time in front of screens. Don't you? I mean, when I listen to these guys, they do seem a little bit different in the way in which they communicate, right? Some of them seem a little robotic. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, come on, that's not like a nobody ever gave that guy a lesson.
Listen, Mark, don't use him as an example of.
No, he's not alone. Come on, but I'm just saying that if you are surrounded in this medium,
sure.
I do think it ends up influencing things normally, even when you're dealing with human beings.
Yeah. And again, I don't think that's something I think it is what it is, to be honest with you, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where, culture evolves. I guarantee you that people talked in the 1940s and 50s and conversed with each other in very different ways than we do today, right? Maybe their sentences were long. I don't know. I'm sure somebody could do a study to...
Well, it's interesting. Look at YouTube. Right, go on YouTube and look at even television programs from 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay, where they're already in the television age, right? Marshall McLuhan time, and you look at the way people were talking back then, and I think we would say, it sounds a little smarter than the way people talk now. I think so. Even though I remember as a kid it didn't seem that way. But now you go back.
No, it is. I agree. The classic movies, for example, the scripts are rich. The characters are rich. And it takes its time, and so on.
So there is a kind of movement, a kind of shift going on. I think the issue is, the issue is what's at stake here. Why do you want to draw the sharp line, right, at the end of the day? Because I do think the Weizenbaum concern, the Dreyfus concern is about dehumanization, right? That there is a sense in which but these guys would go first. See, where they're different from you is they would actually like us to be switching off our machines. Right? They would like us to distance ourselves from these machines.
What do you think? What do you think about that?
I don't think that's to be honest with you, it's, this is what I'm kind of like with Marshall McLuhan on a lot of this stuff. Technology is what shapes the life world. Okay. Yep. And of course we have to be self-conscious about it. And so there's nothing wrong. So for example, I do think there is something to be said for something like what you might call critical media literacy, so that people kind of know what they're getting into when they're getting in front of a screen and when they're communicating. And, I think there's certainly a place for that. But at the end of the day, we're swimming in this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Like critical media literacy for me, it translates very simply, there's a tool that you have, you can hurt yourself using this tool, right? So let us help you make sure that you use it in a way that doesn't hurt you, right? And like any powerful tool, it will hurt you if you're not careful. That's how I see it in a very
Well, let me ask you a question then, because I actually teach this stuff to law students, because there is a lot of concern about whether we need to actually have special legal protections, rights, whatever, for these more sophisticated forms of artificial intelligence. And so one of the issues which turns out to be quite controversial, again, with the artificial intelligence community, is the idea of android companions, right? So, in the first instance, we're talking about robots that, let's say, assist the living of elderly people who can't get around and do stuff for themselves. But it's not possible to put a nurse in everyone's home, right? Because it's just not enough nurses around. There are too many old people. So there's now a big business in in the applied side of artificial intelligence doing these android companions. And so the question then becomes, okay, how do you design the interface for this? And do you want to make these companions human-like, kind of in the way you're posing, in terms of the way they talk to the grandmother or grandfather or whatever? And the tendency has been to make them as human-like as possible, in terms of registering voice, in terms of having all the kind of modulation. A lot of the stuff you were talking about in your video, right? They plug this into the android companion. And the key thing is the old folks like it. Right? The old folks like it. They form bonds with it. They don't see a problem with it. And so this is now, along with military drones, of course, these are the two biggest areas.
There's a lot of money there.
Exactly. And it will be in the future, given the aging population. And so but a lot of roboticists are very disturbed by this. because they say Granny should not be bonding with the machine. Now, where do you stand on that?
I think Granny should bind with whatever she wants to bind with, right? I think if it makes her feel better, right? Why not? I mean, that's my basic, stand on anything really. Like if it doesn't have somebody and makes somebody feel better, right? Let it be. All right. So it's very, very simple. My answer is let it be. What are the consequences of that? Is she going to get hurt? Is the robot going to disappoint her? Well, I guarantee you that her children would disappoint her far more than the robot.
Well, this is a good point. Okay, now you raise a very important point. In terms of when we set the standard of what human is, we tend to, as it were, assume a much higher standard that in fact exists in practice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right, and this is really important, and it even goes to somewhat to the issues about politeness, because man, you got a very you really think human beings are as polite as you make them out to be? I mean, come on, guys. I mean, most human beings act more like your bot.
Well, you're in Britain. You're in Britain. Britain are not very polite.
No, that's if they can get two sentences out. At least your bot could do that. I'm just saying, guy. You have these standards, right? About that humans are polite. I mean, you could be fooled. Martians who aren't familiar with what life on Earth is like could be totally fooled by you.
Okay, let's move on to the next one. This was fun. This one is more serious, right? This one is on being godlike.
Okay, sure. Why not?
Maybe more fun, right? So, in page 35 of your book, you write, and I quote: "For Christians, humanity's fallen nature is twofold. We're much less powerful and much less knowledgeable than God. The only chance we have to recover from that dual loss is by trying to approximate God in our own way, fully realizing that both of our efforts and our feedback from those efforts are bound to be imperfect." End of quote. Okay, so to be sure, right, emulating God or being godlike pushes one towards self-improvement, okay, improvement of the world, towards learning, towards building, solving problems, making the world a better place. Okay, and that's for sure. Okay, now, but emulating God could also mean putting strategy over tactics, or the long term over the short term. Here's what I mean, right? In God's case, right, the end, an end that he doesn't even bother to share with us, justifies the means, right? So in other words, we are supposed to put up with an endless chain of catastrophes, injustices, outrages, horrors, no explanation given, God works in mysterious ways, okay? Doesn't transhumanism engender the spirit of long-term versus short-term? That we need to embrace high risk, absorb the short-term cost as the brave push on to new frontiers? If so, should we not expect the same sort of elusive end that we're getting from God at the high cost of endless pain in the unfolding events towards some unknown ultimate end? Okay.
I think,
Am I being over dramatic here?
No, I think you're basically right. I mean, I think this is the thing. See, look, you're right. And in a way, the point of my book in regard to these issues that you're raising now is that transhumanists need to come clean and admit this, right? Because transhumanism, and I take it this is part of the spirit of your laying this out this way, is that a lot of the popular version of transhumanism, in a way, says we're going to transcend suffering. We're going to transcend all this stuff,
exactly.
right? And we're going to do it by 2040, God damn it, right?
Yep.
I mean, this is...
It's got to be a straight line.
Well, exactly. I mean, and there's no doubt about it that there is this kind of, messianic, we're almost there, guys. Just, one more push, and there we'll go, one more quantum leap into the next technology, and boom, we'll be there in the singularity. I think, yes, there's a lot of that kind of rhetoric around in transhumanism, and I think it's completely misleading because I don't think there's any reason to think that we're going to be reaching the end very soon. So I think it's much more of an attitude. And look, the whole point about risk-taking, right, is about, at the end of the day, your attitude toward loss, right? So that if you're a good gambler, right, the key thing about being a good gambler is not that you win most of the time, but rather you can absorb the losses. That's what keeps you in the game. Okay. And I think this is kind of part of, and I think, in fact, the history of science and technology, insofar as we have maintained our faith in science and technology, despite all the catastrophes, and one might argue increasing catastrophes, right, that have attended the march of progress over the last 200 years. The fact that we continue with the faith, right, shows that we already have this kind of attitude that you're pointing to, right? That we're, in a sense, we'll just suck it up, right? We'll all the risks, all the damage, we'll just, so, okay, Nazi concentration camps, but full speed ahead on genetic engineering, right? Hiroshima happens, boom, nuclear energy, carry on, right? It's going to save the environment now, right? And this is kind of the way we operate. And in a sense, what I'm pointing to in the book is that we really need to be coming clean about this in the sense of being self-conscious. In other words, say, own it, right? Own it. In other words, we would not have got to where we are today if we did not, in fact, have something like this transhumanist kind of secular theology, eschatology, if you will, going on that actually sustains our faith through all of this catastrophe that we seem to be riding out all the time.
Yeah. I think, so how would you characterize the stand of someone who does not come clean? Like, give me an example. How does that manifest itself? Like, people saying what? Like, progress is, like, do they whitewash stuff or what?
Well, it's the business of I mean, you look at the predictions that get made about when we're going to reach the singularity, right? And when we're going to be able to end the aging process by being able to regenerate cells and so forth, right? I mean, it's the dateline that's given for these kinds of things tends to be within the lifespan of
years.
Within the lifespan of the middle youth people who are most attracted to it, right? Right, so because everybody, because these people aren't. I mean, transhumanists aren't stupid. They know that if by the time they're 70 or 75, this stuff hasn't paid off yet, they're not gonna be in a good enough shape to benefit. I mean, so we're really talking. It has to be with the next generation, right? It has to be within the next 10 or 20, maybe 30 years at the most, but no longer than that. You see, and then if you look at the history of these predictions, little by little, they get shifted up over the years, right? And so a lot of stuff that we're now saying is going to happen in 2050. We used to say it was happening in 2020, and I think this is part of the self-deception in a way that goes on, right? Because I think the point I would make about all of this is that there's nothing wrong with believing that ultimately we can reverse aging and ultimately we'll be able to upload our minds into machines and all that. I actually think in some sense, if we stick around long enough, it's in the cards that we will do that. The question is, it's not going to be happening in such a convenient fashion for the people who wish for it, right? The people who are likely to benefit from it are likely to be people who are probably not alive now.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I mean, you mentioned risk, so let me touch on the third point, which is risk, which is a very, very important, central point in all of this. So let me quote you again. In page 37 of your book, you write, and I quote, the current environmental crisis may be seen as the latest version of humanity's fallen state, but its resolution need not mean a return to some imagined state of cosmic equilibrium. Rather, it means pushing nature to a level closer to what we hypothesize as a divine state of being. Again, I do not wish to underestimate the risk involved, but risk is precisely what we are about as human beings. Put another way, it is exactly by taking bold, calculated risks that we acknowledge that we are not fully in control of our fates, and hence pay homage to God. End quote. So we all agree, I think we all agree, this is me speaking now, we all agree that the more radical the innovation, the greater the risk, right? If the rate of innovation continues to increase exponentially, which I think per more and company, right? So we'll risk, so that it is reasonable to say that at some point, things will get so risky that it would be highly irresponsible to move forward. You cite, and I quote a quote, ye shall know them by their bets, end of quote. Will we come to be known as those reckless fools who lost control, didn't realize that they were pushing risk beyond what could be calculated? That's my question.
Yeah. Well, I think time will tell. I do think we're now in a situation where, because here's the thing, I guess because we have staked so much on this trajectory, this kind of modern science and technology trajectory that has got us, so we the climate people say we now live in the Anthropocene, right? Where human beings are the single species most responsible for the condition of the planet. That's quite an what do I say, honor, burden. It's quite an amazing place to be. Let's put it that way. For one species to have that kind of power over the situation, but it's a very uncertain kind of power, right? Because what we don't know, how to exercise it in ways where we can actually get the outcomes that we would like, right? We know how to exert power. But there is always going to be all these unintended consequences. And the more power that we exert, I mean, think of something like geoengineering as a prospect for dealing with climate change in the future, right? That is like the poster boy for the issue, right? In the sense that at one level, it says, of course, this would be the great way to solve the climate crisis. We say, oh my God, that, we just started an even bigger crisis this way, right? You see, and it seems to me that the only thing that we can really do about this, because here's the thing, we're kind of at a point where we're going to have to be doing. It's going to be hard not to do anything, and even doing nothing can turn out to have cataclysmic consequences too. So I just think the only thing we can do is in a way just be responsible about it. I mean, I guess where I disagree a lot with the people who advocate the precautionary principle, which is a very important principle in international environmental regulation. It's a principle in the European Union, for example. It's the sort of thing that always comes up in the climate summits as a kind of normative framework. I think the problem with the precautionary principle, for all of its well-meaning nature, is that it's not clear what it means to be precautionary anymore. In other words, it's not clear. I mean, it's not clear that stopping or retreating from the direction that we've been going in terms of technological progress is either feasible or will actually have desirable consequences, especially if you add in all the political and economic issues that are implied.
So my point really is that innovation is just accelerating, right? And so risk is accelerating. It's going exponential, and so risk is increasing exponentially. One can say that the precautionary principle is making sure that we don't get into a situation where things are out of control, right?
I understand that's the intention, but how do you do it as policy, right? I mean, I think that there's a sense in which people who want to apply the precautionary principle are a bit naive about what, they make it sound like, oh, and now it's obvious, let's accept the precautionary principle. Okay, so what do we do? What exactly do we do to minimize risk? What minimizes risk exactly in the situation that you've just described? It's not clear. It's not clear, especially if we start talking about scaling back science and technology and trying to do some kind of radical overhaul of what the economy overnight. I mean, I'm not quite sure what if you recognize the extent of the issue and you recognize the extent of the risk that's involved. I think you're just in you're going to be doing high risk things no matter what you do.
Okay. Well, why don't we take an example so that we can we stop talking about generalities and just pick something. Let's say there's a therapy, right? The gene therapy that doubles your life. Your healthy life, right? And it's done, and it's sort of proven to be safe to the extent it can, right? And now it needs to be approved by the FDA. It's just basically a therapy that you can go to the doctor's office, and they'll do a couple of things, and you're gonna live twice as long, right? Let's say that happened, which is one of the transhumanism's possibilities, right? This is not completely out of whack as far as they're concerned. Well, in that case, it's very clear what the technology is, right? And it's very clear that I think there is risk, and that needs to be analyzed. Risk could be, okay, what happens psychologically to people, right? Does everybody have access to this thing? And so on and so forth. There's a whole list of things that we can sit down and talk in tangible terms about whether one should or should not be precautionary in that particular case. So if you take that particular case, would you say that the precautionary principle is still useless or vague, or do you see it being operational?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. Because I think the first thing is I think it might be, there's a sense in which if all we were focused on was the safety of the drug, of the therapy for the people who would be having it, you could say, okay, if it's safe, then the FDA should allow it, right? I mean, you could make the argument that simple. But I think the problem, as you were just alluding to, is the problem starts after that, right? The problem starts with that arises from the success, exactly. Right? Yeah. Right, from the fact that this actually is then going to be unfolded, and this is a real weakness, I think, of transhumanism generally, which does tend to tends to have a kind of silver bullet mentality about stuff, right? Where if you actually end the aging process, boom, that in itself will be good. All you have to worry about is whether it's safe to do it from the standpoint of personal safety. And maybe, like you were saying, whether it is sufficiently available for all people to get it, right? But actually, there's more to it than that, right? Much more to it. I mean, and one of the things that I stress in the book, for example, is the extent to which social structures depend on intergenerational change. Yeah. And so in that respect, and for lots of different reasons, which we could go into, that society, because we're talking about all this wonderful innovation that's taking place, but that wonderful innovation that's been taking place for the last 200 years is predicated on intergenerational change. Exactly. Where new people, new ideas, constantly are floating through the system, right? And a lot of the old ideas just get washed away because people forget about them when the old guys die, and that's good. Okay. Yes. And the last thing you want is a bunch of 200-year-old people with perfect memories. Okay. Perfect
memories, and they have built power structure, and
exactly. And they're not going to have kids. They don't need to have kids. They can do it all themselves.
So what happens to the youngsters who are coming in? There's no way for them to find a job.
This is the point. The downstream effects of this, right, would mean a completely different social order.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the thing is, you got to start thinking about that, whether that social order is actually what you want. Right. You have to be, in this respect, I really always think, be careful what you wish for, because you could get the magic bullet that stops aging. Yep. Fine, you could do that, but then look what happens to society as a result.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo, brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.